Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. My name is Razia Cooper, and I am the engagement coordinator for NASW Delaware and New Jersey. And I have the honor and the privilege to be here with the Compassion Agents on this presentation that they are providing today on social workers as immigration psychological evaluators. We are in an age where as social workers, we need to broaden our skill sets and allow ourselves to have more reach. So I'm excited that we have over 150 people in the room that is interested in this topic. Today, when you registered for this event, I just want to make a quick disclaimer. You took a code of ethics saying that you will be respectful to our presenters, myself as chapter staff, and your participants in the chat. So I will be monitoring the chat for questions. If you can mute yourself to keep all the feedback to a minimum, that will be greatly appreciated. But I will be monitoring the chats for questions and for dialogue. I encourage you guys to interact with each other and to ask questions to our participants, not to our participants, to our facilitators. Our facilitators are going to give you an opportunity to ask questions, but I will say if you have a question and you think that you may forget that question, just send it to me directly so that I can have all the questions in one spot and that I can feed it to them when we get to the Q&A section of the presentation. This is an interactive presentation, but this is one that's going to be jam-packed with a lot of learning. So because of that, we want you to be here. So take a moment to just center yourself. If there's something that you're thinking about that you shouldn't be thinking about, I ask that you would just let it go. Tap into your body, something that I do when I host or moderate programs. I ask everyone in the room just to check in with themselves. How are you feeling right now? And if you are bold enough, you can put it in the chat. I am going to just read a little bit about our our facilitators. I'm going to read a little bit about our facilitators and they're going to take it away. So first we have Dalissy Jose Washington, LCSW, and she's the founder and chief executive officer of the Compassion Agents. She is a licensed clinical social worker and bilingual in English and Spanish with over 10 plus years of experience providing immigration psychological evaluations. And we have the co-facilitator Miriam Geiger, LCSW, and she is a chief program officer at the Compassion Agent. She is a licensed clinical social worker and bilingual in English and Spanish. She provides immigration psychological evaluations, and you ladies can take it away. Take it away. We are happy that you're here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Razia. Welcome, everyone. It's a big crowd, so we are excited. But yeah, welcome to Social Workers as Immigration Psychological Evaluators. A special thank you to the National Association of Social Workers Delaware chapter. And thank you to all the participants who are here with us today. I'm Dalissy Jose Washington. As a child of Dominican immigrants, my work as an immigration evaluator is very personal. I'm really passionate about it, all while recognizing that I come from a place of privilege. Many of the families that I serve are unlike the family of immigrants that I was raised in, where I was protected by legal status and buffered by a vibrant Hispanic community in Passaic, New Jersey, very close to New York. So my journey with immigration evals began almost immediately after obtaining my master's degree. It really just fell into my lap. That's what most providers say, because I happened to be working at a clinic that served a large population of undocumented immigrants. So in early 2018, I went into solo practice, simply offering immigration evals. And in response to the need in the community, the Compassion Agents was born, where we're now a group practice, and our sole service at the office are immigration evaluations. Miriam has joined me for the ride, and we were colleagues long before all of this. And so I'm gonna let her introduce herself and we'll quickly get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation.
Very excited and happy to be here. It's really great that we're able to share our knowledge and expertise with you guys. I am Miriam Geiger, and I started working with Dalissy actually as my first internship for my undergrad degree. And that is where I started working for the first time with undocumented folks. There's a large population of um, migrant workers, folks with all different types of immigration status. But the clinic we were working at particularly served folks that didn't have insurance. So that was where I really started to learn a lot about the migrant experience, especially locally. And ever since then, my focus on my work in social work has been supporting individuals through that process. Particularly with social work, as I'm sure a lot of you guys have experienced, me and Dalissy both came up against the frustrations of like the limitations and how we were able to help. And so it was very exciting to be able to find this way of really, I always kind of describe it as helping with this extra key to help get through the door, right? They have all these other steps of their immigration process, but this is just a huge essential piece and way that we're able to support folks. So I've been working with Dalissy specifically doing psychological evaluations for the past 4 years. And now that is all I do. I just recently ended with my client caseload that I had kept for several years while doing this work, and now it's our sole focus. So we're very excited to tell you more about it.
So this presentation is not only for social workers, it's for any mental health provider and even beyond for community providers, community leaders. There's a huge need for evaluations, and we're honored that we have the credentials to step in at such a pivotal time in history. We know that as long as there's poverty, violence, persecution in other parts of the world, people will continue to come to the United States to seek freedom, peace, stability, and safety, as they should. And so immigration evaluations are just one way to support mixed status families that are battling immigration system, one that we know continues to be ineffective and inhumane. We have a lot to cover today, so please do, you can submit your questions on the chat. They will be monitored. Because we have such a big group, I'm pretty sure that we're just gonna go through the majority of our slides and discussion, and then at the end, we should have more than enough time to address all of the questions. If anything comes up, feel free, Resia, like if you want to mute yourself and let us know, but otherwise I think we should be fine.
Yes, you can go through. I will let you know if I need you.
Thank you, thank you. So as I mentioned, although we're social workers, we know our field particularly is grounded in challenging social injustice. And as I mentioned, this is going to be relevant to anyone, but for a moment, I want to refer to our NASW Code of Ethics, which states that social workers should act to expand choice and opportunity for all people, with special regard for vulnerable, disadvantaged, oppressed, and exploited people and groups. Today, we're highlighting immigrants, specifically undocumented immigrants in the United States. Undocumented immigrants, because they lack legal protections, face discrimination and limited access to services. We know we need policies that protect all immigrants. And by offering a pathway to citizenship, really that's what ensures added access to essential services without the discrimination and harassment or risk of deportation. Mental health providers who serve as immigration evaluators are stepping in a way that really increases the chances of many immigrant families. And I'll note that many immigrants remain without any sort of pathway or open door to citizenship because of eligibility and different things. Additionally, Standard 6 in our Code of Ethics reads that social workers should promote conditions that encourage respect for cultural and social diversity within the United States and globally. So our training session is really going to be a comprehensive understanding of psychological evaluations within that immigration context. And then we're really focusing on the opportunity to utilize cultural humility and what the clinical applications look like when we're serving this unique population.
Next, we'll get into our learning objectives. We're going to start by going over the role of psychological evaluations, giving you lots of details about how, like who qualifies, what that looks like when we use those types of evaluations. We're going to go through the differences between evaluations versus treatment services. We're going to be applying cultural humility principles as well. And in the end here, we're going to be talking more about the clinical application. So we're going to have some practical application um, in addition to all of the information that we're providing here.
So before we jump in, I just wanted to share a few stats. In the US, our immigrant community comprises of mixed status families. So that means that there are some members that are US citizens or lawful permanent residents, while others are undocumented. The Department of Homeland Security estimates that there are 11.4 million unauthorized or undocumented immigrants living in the United States. The top countries of origin are Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, India, Honduras, and China. Now, approximately 18 million US children live with at least one immigrant parent. And in fact, children of immigrants represent the fastest growing group of American youth. There are obviously key problems that I have to use this time to share. The key problems with the US immigration system, I would say it's a very long list. But for starters, there is a huge backlog and delays. And so prolonged processing times lead to family separation and extended waits, year-long waits for reunification or adjustment of their status in the US. There's also complexities and a lot of confusion. There are complicated laws that contribute to mistakes, rejections, and delays in different application processes, and limited pathways to legal status. So undocumented immigrants face deportation fears while also being restricted to access to essential services or without any sort of access or open door to be able to process their legal status. Enforcement practices can be aggressive. Deportations and raids create fear and also hinder access to education and healthcare or even legal services. There's also a lack of legal representation. Many immigrants either lack legal aid or the resources, and there's a lack of understanding of their rights and fair representation in court. We have a group of immigrants that continue to live with uncertainty, even if they have certain protections. So DACA, for example, leaves their recipients who have been here since they were children anxious about their future without providing any sort of pathway to citizenship. They receive work authorization, but remain without a pathway to actual their green card or citizenship. This is also true for temporary visas. And we're not going to cover all of that today, but this is important information. We also know that there's inadequate support for integration, and so limited support for language classes, job training, cultural integration, discrimination, and minority stress that interferes with full integration and feeling welcomed. Obviously, comprehensive immigration reform is needed to address these issues, and there is a big it's urgent. It's very urgent. So I think for us, any chance we have to support or advocate, that's what we want to model so that we're welcoming more immigrants and showing what it really should look like.
And before we go any further, we felt it important to discuss a little bit with respect to communicating our allyship, particularly terms to avoid and preferable terms. Some of this is probably not new to a lot of you folks, but we wanted to make sure to highlight the point that to not be using terms like illegal immigrant, illegal alien, or just illegals. Another term that we've heard is anchor baby in terms of referring to citizen children of undocumented immigrants or undocumented alien. Instead, we're saying undocumented immigrant, unauthorized immigrant. Immigrant without papers is something I often hear clients refer to themselves as immigrant seeking status or foreign born. So again, we're looking from the strengths-based perspective and not looking to be incriminating anybody in terms of talking about their status. So the use of language is something that will come back up again in terms of talking about the interviews and the report writing. So we wanted to make sure to start with using undocumented or folks with varying statuses. So into our first goal here, we're going to be going through the role of psychological evaluations. So that will include defining the evaluations. We'll talk a little bit about the types of cases. We'll provide some case examples and talk about the profound impact and role that these reports have on the cases, and then also our roles as expert witnesses in providing these reports.
Alrighty, so just for reference, you'll see, actually, no, I'll explain that later. So immigration evaluations are psychological assessments that are used as supportive evidence to help immigrant courts or USCIS determine whether an individual will be able to remain lawfully in the US. So immigration courts is at the federal level, and the case is presented in front of a judge. When I say or USCIS, USCIS refers to US Citizenship and Immigration Services. So that office processes different applications that we will refer to as an administrative application. And immigration courts is when we have cases that have to present in court. Not all of them do. So the immigration evaluation is meant to assess and explain hardships, risk factors that qualified family members would face if said person faces deportation or is unable to adjust their status in the US. A qualified member can either be the person without status, or it can be their family members, either United States citizen spouses or children, as an example, or if they have legal permanent residence. And we'll explain more of that later. I also like to explain or describe evals as an in-depth presentation of their life history. So you're covering past, present, and an anticipated future. It's their trauma history, thinking of protective factors, risk factors, and the most important question is, what is the psychological impact within said context? Typically, an attorney informs a client that they will need this type of psychological evaluation. All immigration cases do not require it. We will be talking about the most common cases that I would say not only require it, but like definitely need it. And then we can say immigration attorneys are typically a referral source, unless we're talking about word of mouth or individuals that are just seeking out our services because they've already been told that they need this type of evaluation. Evaluations can be administered by licensed mental health providers. Most clients are paying out of pocket for this service, in addition to all other legal fees. And in our experience, evaluations can range anywhere from $500 to $3,000. And that's dependent on a number of different things: how many people are being evaluated, what type of case it is, if expert testimony is needed. And I usually recommend that the report be solely used for their immigration case. And because of the reason for a referral, insurance, health insurance isn't typically used for it. So statistics are limited, but based on current reports and even just our experience, immigration courts traditionally regard the psychological evaluation. They weigh it heavily, and it seems that cases are twice as often granted than if they presented without a psychological evaluation.
All right, so we're going to get into our first two types of cases. We particularly lumped these two together because the report writing process is similar for both of them. So first, we're going to talk about extreme hardship waiver. So that is when the U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident, that's what USC and LPR stand for. So if that's a spouse with status or the parent is applying for an undocumented spouse or child legal status. And they are requesting that the 10-year bar from the U.S. be waived due to potential hardship to the U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident person. So for a lot of folks, people expect that if you are to marry a U.S. citizen, then you can just get status. But if you have entered the U.S., what they would consider unlawfully, then there is this 10-year bar that you would be expected to return to your home country for 10 years before being able to receive status. And so this waiver is a filing process with USCIS. It doesn't require court. And this evaluation is an essential key part to that, to evaluate what the hardship would be to the family if there was this forced relocation. And for cancellation, the major difference is that it is in court. There is an order of deportation for a family member. So this is the termination of removal proceedings or an order of deportation. This includes hardship factors as well. We're going to go into the details of what those hardship factors look like, and generally includes the evaluation of all the U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident children under the age of 21. So for the extreme hardship waiver, usually we're interviewing one adult, while with cancellation, we're often interviewing multiple children. So the context of the evaluation is different. Also for extreme hardship, usually we are not interviewing the undocumented person. Often for cancellation of removal, we are interviewing the undocumented person in the context of getting history of the children, in addition to evaluating the children. With the hardship factors, so like you see here, it says extreme hardship waiver. So we're evaluating extreme hardship as defined by USCIS. But for cancellation, the hardship is bumped up a few notches. It is exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. So the stakes are much higher and the standards are much higher in terms of being able to make a case for the family that there would be irreparable harm to the family members in the case of, the deportation or forced relocation. For the cancellation cases, they do go to court and there is a government attorney there to challenge the case. Expert witness may be needed for these cases. We often have attorneys request us to prepare and be available for court. It's not as common that they actually need our testimony. Usually the individuals of the family provide testimony during that time, and if they need more support, then they'll call us in. But again, as Dalissy mentioned, we've gotten feedback over and over again from attorneys that our reports weigh very heavily in the judge's decisions in these cancellation removal cases. And another note about that in terms of eligibility, individual must be living in the US for 10 years to be eligible for either the waiver. And does that also apply to the cancellation?
I know for a fact for cancellation, there are many legal aspects in terms of eligibility. One of them is that they have resided in the US 10 years.
And another component to cancellation that we've definitely encountered multiple times is that with the cancellation case, it can include a person who is detained. There's been times where we've done cancellation cases for the individual who's detained, interviewing the family members, and then there's also cases in which we've interviewed individuals while they're detained. Those are different types of cases we'll get into. So was there anything else you wanted to add to that, Valerie?
I think that was good. I'm going to cover more of the hardship factors, and I think that'll help for you participants to really get a handle on the things that are considered.
So we figured we'd give you some case examples to kind of conceptualize these ideas. This is Alejandra. This was a case that actually was highlighted in the Living Undocumented documentary, which is highly recommended. So this is an individual who is going through a cancellation process, married to a legal permanent resident spouse with 2 US-born children. In a case like this, if we were saying that she is living without status for over 20 years, if she does not have an order of deportation, then she can apply for the hardship waiver. This would be a pathway to citizenship. So this would be family members often go through this process because motivated by the stress and concern about potential deportation risk, even if they haven't gone through proceedings. A lot of family members will describe their fear of leaving the house, driving, day-to-day activities. There's a multitude of impact of living undocumented. And so this would be a pathway to citizenship. They would go through the filing, and we would be interviewing her partner here, her spouse, to understand what are his vulnerabilities, what are the vulnerabilities to the family. He would also be able to include the children in the context. We would talk, when we go through the hardship factors, we would be able to mention the children as a concern, but the focus would be on the legal permanent resident spouse. Now, if there was some kind of legal issue, like she had encountered a DUI or she was previously detained, which is very common, then that is a cancellation case. So we are approaching this in the sense of trying to cancel her deportation, making a case for why the family would be profoundly impacted if she were either to be forced to separate from the family, that if she was deported and her family remained in the US. And we also talk about what the concerns would be if the whole family chose to relocate. And in the case that both the parents are undocumented, then it would apply, and she didn't have a cancellation case at this point, they would have to wait until their children turn 21 to be able to apply for the hardship. So again, the details of the situation and the cases always depend on a bunch of different, multitude of nuances here. We know that our families face the same and also worse social ills as any other family. They meet the repercussions, and then from there it can be passed on to ICE. So we were talking about specifically, like if there was some kind of situation with a DUI, a lot of times folks will go through and they meet their classes, they pay the fines, they go home. There might not even be a detention, but then that case being passed on to immigration enforcement, that will be how they end up being detained. Sometimes it's weeks, months, sometimes it's years later, really depending on the roles of the administration currently. We've seen that in the past, really 8 years, the drastic swings in people being targeted by ICE many years after having some kind of issue and already resolving it. So that was one effort for advocacy has been to keep the immigration enforcement out of the county jails, and to reduce the collaboration between law enforcement and immigration. It's an ongoing battle, and it's different from state to state and even city to city, what that'll look like in different communities.
So I want to highlight the number of years, like the extensive waits. So think about these families, even if you have Alejandra who might be applying for the extreme hardship application, they may spend quite a bit of time organizing the information. And then once that application is submitted to USCIS, they have to wait for a response. And I think most recently, I don't know if anything has changed, that wait could be as long as 3 years, where before it was.
Social workers. Okay. Rosie, are you saying something today?
Okay, sorry about that. And so for cancellation cases, my experience has been I've met with families that have had multiple court hearings without decisions being made or waiting for their final court hearing. And we're talking, it could be over 10 years. And so I want to bring that to the attention of those who may not know about how extensive these waits can be. Also, the point that pathway to citizenship begins with first obtaining legal permanent residence. And it's another 5 years with that status before you can even apply to be a US citizen. But I digress. That's just a little interjection of, what they suffer and how long the waits are before things are solidified and they're quote unquote safe. So now's our opportunity to really talk about what are these hardship factors that an immigration judge or USCIS takes into account. And just to give you an example, those designations of extreme hardship and different levels and standards. So it means that determinations and decision-making is based on these factors that we're about to cover, the arguments and the evidence that's submitted on behalf of the family. And it said that they do consider all of the factors in totality and cumulatively. So it may mean, for example, let me run off the list really quick. So we're considering family separation, family ties, economic impact, educational, healthcare concerns, social and cultural impact, crime and safety concerns. That's not all encompassing, but those are the broad categories that USCIS has specifically stated that when they're considering the well-being of the qualified members, these are the things that they are looking into. But to give you an example, if there's more concerns in the area of healthcare or medical, standalone, they may say, that's not enough of a concern, and it can be minimized. But let's say they have that's cumulatively considered with, I don't know, the economic or psychological impact, then obviously their case is going to be stronger. So when we are sitting down with, for these evaluations, we're really trying to make sure that we have a good understanding. We're getting to know them and we're covering that entire life history, but we're also focusing on these different hardship factors. As providers, I think our training, I think of it as more just risk factors. Like, let's think of all of the things that we know could really be detrimental and cause added distress. And so when we think of family separation, actually for all the factors, we're considering the implications if they remained in the United States without their loved one, or if they had to travel abroad. And so it is, going back and forth between they would suffer with either of those, if either of those things happen, whether they're in the US or living abroad, but we do provide the distinction and explain what that would look like. So to give you an example, we can think of Alejandra's family again that we presented. In that image, you saw, I'm actually going to bring them up again, I think. So you see this beautiful family, right? So if we say that the well-being, depending, I'll start with extreme hardship. If we're talking about family separation, and this is a true story, Alejandra did end up being deported. And so she ended up, as a family, they decided that she would only be traveling without, she would only be traveling with her youngest daughter. And that meant that her husband and adolescent daughter would stay in the US. So in that case, we'd be talking about family separation, not just from the loved one, but also family separation between a father and daughter and spouse, and then family separation for that adolescent daughter from her mom and her younger sibling. A lot of times we're just talking about repeated trauma or re-traumatization and what it would look like for any change in the family to occur. And then when we get to family ties, which is another hardship factor, it gives us an opportunity to talk about what ties they have to their community here, or what it would look like. Are there extended family members? Many of these families have been here so many years that really they would be returning abroad without any family members that could support them emotionally, financially, in every way, right? As they try to restart their life. Economic impact really goes into any financial implications, whether they're facing poverty abroad, or if we're speaking of the dependence on the spouse, on their loved one, based on being the sole breadwinner or needing a two-income household to raise 5 children, to give an example. So it's really, these factors give us an opportunity to personalize the information. I think generally speaking, we can explain how it would be detrimental, but the goal of that evaluation is really to understand uniquely for that family how they would be impacted for these different areas. Educational impact is another one that's also considered. And when I think of educational impact, I'm also thinking about professional goals. So whether children or adults, we are considering what educational needs may exist, even if it's special education or if there are implications with an IEP in place, or for individuals who may be pursuing set professional goals and having access to that. Between economic and educational, we can also speak of whether they would even have access to gainful employment or training opportunities if they had to live in another country. Sorry, I skipped 1 second. Okay. And then we are health providers. We all know that, right? And so when we think of healthcare concerns, I always say we have to make sure that we capture in a very comprehensive manner all medical concerns. And it's sometimes we have to dig that information out. Hospitalizations, what medications are you taking? What is the family history for medical conditions? And if there are any medical concerns, because we want to make sure that an immigration judge or USCIS doesn't say, well, you're not a medical provider, you have no place to speak of this. No, in that report, we have an opportunity to tie in the medical and psychological, even if it is thinking about how stressors impact treatment planning or the ability to keep up with a treatment plan when one has a chronic illness. Or if we're tying in, more than often, we're always bringing in how a trauma history also predisposes individuals to chronic health issues. And sometimes we don't have the best reporters. So we're making a lot of the connections after we review our notes and obtain the information. Or sometimes clients will send their medication list and we pick up on other diagnoses that they forgot to mention, or other indicators. For social and cultural impact, again, really it's all encompassing, but I'm trying to give different examples. And so for social and cultural, even if you think of how long they've been out of their home country, and how they would lack the resources and connections to their community to be able to live safely and comfortably. The well-being of the children, you know, if they've been raised all of their lives here in the US, what would it look like if they had to reboot everything and start anew in their parents' home country, what that would look like. There's also an opportunity to speak of any concerns based on their own identities and being rejected in their community. Or if we're speaking to spouses from different countries, what that would mean, or if there would be anticipated discrimination in other places. I even think of social and cultural impact as if we have a single mother staying behind with her children and what that would mean for her and what access to services she'd go without, or how that would complicate things and how she's treated in her community. So again, we try and make sure that we're understanding their stories and that they provide examples, but we also have an opportunity to explain things and make certain connections to strengthen the report based on our clinical impressions. Crime and safety concerns are huge with the populations we serve. I like to include specific examples of stories they've heard or family members that still live there, or if they've been through their own crime victimization stories, whatever it is, right? Like, we make sure that we're able to highlight if there are any crime and safety concerns. Ransom kidnapping is something that happens quite a bit. And so if they lack the resources, finances, and connections to live safely, then that is something that can be addressed as we consider all of those hardship factors. This is usually my main focus. As we speak of the other types of cases, this isn't necessarily the main focus, but it's certainly questions that are posed during an evaluation to understand all of the reasons behind their need for a pathway to citizenship in the US, or reasons why they wouldn't be able to sustain or support their family from abroad. I'll bring your attention, if you haven't already, to the image in front of you, where it's that, and just the distress or pressure of all of these different elements. That's what we see. Individuals are coming to us. They may be the first time that they've allowed themselves to even consider what the worst case or implications would be, because really they're functioning on survival mode and avoidance and just trying to get by day to day. And as much fear as they're in, sometimes there isn't the space to really consider what it would mean for their family if they have to face deportation, or like we said, for waiver, it may just be a temporary period of separation. But what does 10 years look like for an individual to have to be without their spouse, or living with that uncertainty and all of these other risk factors that would arise? So now we're going to share another of the most common cases we receive, which is asylum. And I quickly want to mention that there is a difference between asylum seekers and refugee seekers. So for both, the similarity is that they are fleeing their home country due to harm or persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. The difference is that asylum seekers are seeking protections once they've already arrived to the United States, whereas refugees have already obtained permissions while they were still in their home country. So they have permissions to be here. More than likely, they are already a part of, once they arrive, they're a part of a program where they may have some resources and access to certain protections, whereas asylum seekers are really making a case for themselves while they're already here. And so what that means is that for these psychological evaluations, I've never seen a refugee. I would love to talk to them directly, but I've never been in a position where I need to provide a psychological evaluation for them. For asylum seekers, on the other hand, really that immigration evaluation is a manner to establish their credibility and their ability to be able to share their story and explain why they had to flee their country and why they are afraid of a return. Our job is to really capture that psychological impact more than anything. But unlike the other cases, for this one, it's really heavy on understanding the details leading up to their escape or having to leave their country. And it can be very trauma heavy. We get a lot of individuals and families, even young children. And sometimes that could be gender-based violence or gang violence based on organized crime. There's also, just remember this, asylum cases typically do present in immigration court, like cancellation cases. And so the stakes are higher. It's difficult to win asylum cases right now. And so the report does weigh heavily. There is a difference, and this is more on the legal end, so I won't get too much into it, but there are some asylum cases that are administrative applications, and those are considered affirmative asylum cases. And essentially it means there's some protections from deportation, but the process looks different. And most of the time, that also means that it's not a pathway to citizenship. It simply gives them some sort of protection from deportation. Now, what we're most accustomed to is those that do present in front of an immigration judge, and it can be various court hearings before their individual or final hearing, where a final decision is made about whether their case will be granted and if they can remain in the United States. We wanted to bring up a face that you can relate to and start to understand these things. And so I want you to meet Luis. Luis was also featured in the Living Undocumented documentary, which I highly recommend. Again, it's really sad and hard, but when you're ready emotionally, and if you haven't seen it, it's a good look at the type of cases that we serve with these immigration evaluations. And I believe they highlighted 8 different types of cases. And so for this one with Luis, he was featured, but it was more of a focus on his girlfriend, who you see beside him, because she was an asylum seeker that was facing an order of deportation, with her son, who was Luis, I guess, stepson. They were both facing deportation. She was pregnant at the time with Luis' child. I won't go too much into that. I'm going to focus on Luis right now. And I don't even know the details of his migrant story, but I know that he's from Honduras. So for purposes of giving you an example of asylum, I'm going to say that, let's say he was an asylum seeker and he presented at our office. We can say that he was fleeing gang violence. Our priority would be to sit down with him and be able to capture all of those details that led up to his escape, per se. And so we would ask questions about whether he sought protections from law enforcement in his home country, his efforts to gain protection from authorities at any level, why and how he escaped, chronologically the details of when he began to be targeted by gangs. A lot of the cases we receive, it may be that they were receiving death threats by the time they had to flee, because they continued to deny or not accept recruitment into a gang. And so we would need to understand the different ways that they were targeted. We'd also consider the safety and stability that he's been able to access being in the United States, and what his healing after such trauma and leaving everything behind has been like. Also, what are the concerns for re-traumatization if he returns, and what are the vulnerabilities that would result in repeated trauma? That is our job, right, as clinicians, to really develop that information. And that is the bulk of the assessment, as much as what are the details of the stories and an accurate timeline of events. With asylum seekers, there's also an expectation that they file for asylum within their first year of being in the US. And so for some of these cases, if they are beyond that point, which usually their immigration attorneys are able to communicate that, we may need to establish what were the barriers, or what really got in the way of them submitting an application within that year and that filing deadline. It's also about being able to capture how is it that they still remain at risk of being victimized upon a return, especially if years have gone by. So, is it that they would be identified? Are they still living in the same community? So that also has to be established, that there is still a concern upon return. I want to add, for asylum, we have been receiving other types of evals now. For example, for our students, let's say, that are coming from Ukraine, or if if they're studying here, but they're expected to return based on the permissions they have to be in the US as a student or a professional, then we have been getting cases where they're able to explain, because of the current war, what their feared return would be, and being able to process for permissions to remain in the US versus having to return to their home country that is currently at war.
All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the other case types. These are all USCIS filings and their special designation for different types of experiences while living in the US. So these are for cases that are based on victimization after coming to the US. So our first one is U visa. That's for survivors of crime. That can be any type of crime victimization. And it needs to show the substantial mental or physical abuse while living in the US and that they were willing to assist law enforcement. It's a huge component to this process here. So we're often using police reports to support the narrative that was provided by the clients. The next one is the Violence Against Women's Act, VAWA. And this is for, despite the name, this is for folks of any gender, but this allows abused spouses or children of US citizens or lawful permanent residents who had experienced abuse. And this could also be abused parents of US citizens' children, which is rarer, but cases that we have come across in the past. So for example, we've had undocumented parents who were being emotionally and physically abused by their adolescent daughter, which resulted in severe psychological impact and limited their functioning in some ways. And so that would be a case that they were able to apply for VAWA designation because of the domestic violence. And domestic violence, one thing that we always want to identify that includes intimate partner violence, right? So we're also talking about other violence among family members, whether or not it's a romantic spouse or not. Most commonly, the cases that we've seen have been individuals who are married to US citizens who suffered abuse. And then the next one here is the T visa, which is for undocumented folks that had suffered trafficking, and that can be sex or labor trafficking after arriving in the US. One of the designations here is severe form of trafficking in persons, and that they assisted law enforcement with the detection, with the investigation or persecution of the acts of trafficking. So of course, with each of these cases, there's these nuances in terms of what should be focused on in the evaluation. For the U visa and T visa, it's very important that we include in the narrative of the story, not just what are the abuses that they've suffered and the different types and the timeline of events, but also including the narrative of how they engaged with law enforcement and how they participated. That's a particularly important piece to these puzzles. For these cases, for me, my experience is that it is a little different in the sense that for a lot of these cases, we're still getting the full life story. So we're hearing the story of all of the motivating factors that led up to them coming to the US, which often starts with victimization of some kind or some kind of profound suffering, and then coming to the US and being particularly vulnerable as undocumented individuals. That can be based on just the lack of resources and needing support and ending up in abusive environments, whether that's with an abusive partner or an abusive employer. And so there's this real particular challenge in describing how their sense of safety and stability got affected, how they've demonstrated a long-term emotional impact, and then also continuing to make the case, like we talked for in like the asylum concerns. In these reports, we're also discussing why is it important that they're able to remain in the US and receive some kind of status. For T visa particularly, we're talking about the risk of re-victimization as undocumented individuals who suffered trafficking. Folks who have been in those environments and are not granted status remain vulnerable to repeated labor trafficking. Either from the same employer or different ones. There have been times that we've done these cases and either for VAWA or T visa that the individuals may still be in that environment. So those are all concerns that might come up in providing these types of evaluations. So we wanted to provide, again, another case example. This is Julia. She was a victim of abuse by a US citizen spouse. So this is a VAWA case. A lot of times we will see domestic violence cases be filed as U visa because they suffered crime victimization and had a police report. Also, that is an option if they are not married or if their partner isn't a US citizen. So then they wouldn't have the VAWA designation, it would be the U visa instead. The reports look very different, different types of filing. But this is, the case with Julia is suffering the intimate partner violence after arriving in the US. A lot of times we will see that folks have the fear of reporting due to the lack of their status or their partner status. Often that is a part of the abuse, that their immigration status is a means of threat that their partner will use against them. Often people are scared of reporting abuse because of their concern for their children or fear of their partner facing consequences. But again, like we said, being undocumented make these individuals particularly vulnerable to abusive partnerships. So in sitting down with Julia, what we would talk about is, again, her life history, motivations of coming to the US, where we might identify some risk and vulnerabilities already, to be able to kind of explain the narrative throughout. And then we'll go through the history of what the relationship, how it started. What was it like in the beginning? How did it start to deteriorate? A lot of times I will have folks go through the narrative of their story, explaining the different incidences that they experienced. And then we'll go through often down the list of, maybe they didn't bring up the situation of sexual abuse, but they told me the narrative of suffering the emotional and verbal and physical. And then upon asking and inquiring a little further and probing more and digging deeper, we'll learn, well, she never once felt like she was able to consent, that it was the threat of harm. And to her, with her cultural perspective, she didn't identify that as abuse. But we're able to speak to that in the report, right? So the goal all along here with any of these reports is to elicit the client feedback and help them also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but in terms of understanding for themselves, what was the psychological impact to me? How is this still impacting my relationships? Why was it so hard for me to leave? That's something that, of course, comes up a lot in these types of scenarios. So we'd be sitting with her and not just talking about the history, and then also discussing what is the concern about going back? Why is it important to stay in the US now? And a lot of times we'll be making the case for the stability they've been able to establish after leaving that relationship.
All right, so as we mentioned, the evaluations are really a crucial piece of evidence. Attorneys are using the reports sometimes to even prepare their briefs or just provide the context so that they are well informed of vulnerabilities that might hold the most weight based on their legal perspective. So I always say it should be a collaborative process, although some attorneys never really communicate with us. So we know what we're looking for, but sometimes there is that opportunity. The other thing is you may have individuals that are showing up and they may be revealing details that actually strengthens their immigration case. And it may be details that they never felt. It's the first time they're sharing it during that evaluation. And so it may be information that their attorney didn't even capture yet. And so we know the evaluations lead to a higher likelihood of their case being approved or granted. And so I hold that weight. And that is why the way that I describe what it is and what it isn't is important. And so it is not the report that ends up averaging, I would say, if it's a really good one, 10 to 20 pages, it depends, but it's a pretty long report because it's not the way that we're typically trained. It's not this like basic biopsychosocial assessment or what we do at intake where we're just jotting down all of the information. Really what it becomes is we're interpreting and integrating all relevant information and bringing it all together, the medical, the educational, social concerns, psychological, all of those hardship factors, being able to bring them together to make the connections, associations, and describe clinically what the detriment or the negative psychological impact would be. And so it's really about like clarifying the details that the client has provided. Obviously, as we get into diagnosis, it's also explaining what does that diagnosis look like? in the context of the immigration implications. And then standard best practice now, because it's used as evidence, is that psychological evaluation be included. Now, that psychological evaluation is only one piece of evidence, along with this, like, all this other documentation that families have to provide, prepare, letters, their own declaration or affidavit, like their own interpretation of what they would suffer. So our eval is really a licensed provider solidifying and saying, yes, based on what we know about trauma and protective factors, risk factors, this is how this family would suffer. The report is also verifying credibility and giving more significance to whatever it is that they're reporting. One example of this is, let's say the family is submitting their medical records, letters from doctors' offices indicating they're being treated for this or that, or IEP for their child. Our report then really needs to go into what does said medical diagnosis really look like? How does it affect their day-to-day functioning? What it would look like if it's left untreated, because they now have no access to continuation of care, or no access at all in their home country, whatever that is. But it's being able to speak of whatever's on that list of concern and develop it so that it's explained to the reader, who ends up deciding how much weight it holds. Attorneys have told us that this amount of detail in reports is really what leads to better outcomes. And so we've stuck to it. And our recommendation is always that everything be super detailed, defined, and described. We mentioned that most cases are the administrative process within the USCIS office, but there are times for asylum or cancellation cases that present in front of an immigration judge where we are asked to serve as expert witnesses. And that's broadly defined as someone who's qualified by knowledge, skill, experience, training, or education, and who has specialized in that to assist an immigration judge to understand the evidence. And so when we're submitting a report, whether or not we serve as expert witnesses, that report is submitted into evidence. The opportunity, if we have to testify, is really to explain what's already in the report, to be honest. Sometimes it is a cross-examination, a government attorney who's representing the immigration office, and often is, I say, looking to deport the individual. They may have added questions, and so it's an opportunity for the mental health provider to develop a little further or highlight what holds, I guess, what are the strongest points trying to be made off of this very long report. For those cases, I do request to speak to the attorney in advance, just to find out if they're aware of what's most important to highlight, or if there's certain things that they know they want to ask about, or if they're aware of what the immigration judge or the government attorney may want to understand more about. And so it just allows for more strengthening of the case, to be honest. And so it is not required. It is up to us as providers if we do, but the truth is that if we can, it obviously helps. And so if it's requested, I know in my office, we are blocking our schedule to be available for the court hearing.
Dalissy, I have a few questions that I wanted to know. Can we just take a break to answer? Because I have at least 20 questions right now, and I don't want to hold them for the end because we're getting a lot more. So if we could just answer a few of them.
Yeah, this is actually perfect timing. So we could do a midpoint check-in, and if there's anything that we know we're going to cover later, we will. But it's a lot. So let's see what people are asking.
So one of the first questions that I've gotten a few of is how does one become authorized to conduct the psychological immigration evaluations?
So that one's easy. According to USCIS or immigration courts, it's a licensed I would say clinical license, so a licensed mental health provider. Now, obviously, you understand all of the context, but the truth is that there is no set like certification or designation. As long as you are a licensed provider, you can sign off. To your discretion, though, please seek supervision, or if it's your first time doing it, and you'll see why as we provide more information about what that report should look like.
And I will say that that answers another question I got. We got two individuals wanting to know, can they work under an LCSW as an LMSW to perform the evaluation? So you're just saying seek supervision.
Yes, and I would say check with the law office, because I'll be honest, I've done it, and we know what is allowed within our, set profession, that we function in that way, but we just have to make sure that Immigration Services understands how and what we're doing, and then this is a supervising person signing off, that type of thing, and what we're eligible to do.
Okay, perfect.
And to speak to that, I wanted to say also, if we've ever had something like an LSW, like with a master's that we're signing off on clinically, those are usually for administrative cases, not for cases appearing in court.
Yeah, that would be the other recommendation, just because the stakes are higher and they could come after it. Thank you.
And then I have a clarification question. It was a few slides ago and someone wanted to know, can an immigration evaluation support an asylum application case? Okay, an immigration evaluation will support an asylum application / case, but won't help an asylee apply for cancellation of removal unless they have 10 years in the United States.
I'm a little confused. The question in itself is a little, so I'll just clarify that immigration evaluations strengthen and are used as evidence to support a cancellation of removal case, an asylum case, any type of asylum case, if it's requested. And those are the two things they mentioned. So
yes,
it sounds like the question was, if it's an asylum case that's in deportation proceedings, do they need to have 10 years in the US to be able to do the like cancellation of deportation? But those are different things. So cancellation with an asylum is different than deportation outside of the context of asylum.
I don't know.
okay.
Does that make sense?
I mean, if the person is on, they can send me a follow-up question and I'll provide that if they're still on. And then the last one I will ask before you get into the rest of your presentation is, how do you present or how do you process the evaluations, and what are the rationales for them?
I think we're going to get into that when we talk about report writing.
Okay.
Because that'll cover rationale. If it's a rationale, I'm thinking in a straightforward manner, that after you obtain the information, it's really just, do you believe that the recommendation is that the family would suffer, or that there will be detrimental psychological effects based on their trauma history and all of the things we're covering. But I think we'll cover more of that when we get into what that final report needs to look like. And we can say there are cases, usually they're vetted before they get to us, but there can be a case where upon evaluation, if we don't believe that it will support or that there's a credibility issue, then obviously as clinicians, it's up to us whether we provide that report or say that, we're not providing a finalized report upon meeting with them. So.
Okay. And I know you touched base on this really quickly, but another hot topic was, how are you guys assigned your clients? Does someone refer them to you? And I know you mentioned earlier, but it's been asked a lot. So if you could remind them.
Yeah, so I'll reiterate that the referrals, honestly, It could be word of mouth because we're known in the community, or a family member says, oh, when they asked me for a psychological evaluation, so-and-so office helped me. So I'll say either word of mouth, or because we've done this for so long, we do have, in our case, over like 30 law offices that already know how we work. And so they are, when they have a case that requires a psychological evaluation, they are referring them to my office. Now, we are not working for the law office. We're representing the client. And so that's a part, we're providing that service they need. But yeah, usually the referrals come from an immigration attorney. And there was one more thing I was going to say, but I lost my train of thought. Oh, we know that law offices, they might have their own little referral list. So they'll tell clients, for this type of case, you need an immigration evaluation. You can call these different places and decide who you'd like to hire for this service. So we do know that. That 10-year that was mentioned in one of the other questions, when we mentioned it, it was, just to clarify, that applies for cancellation of removal cases. But for asylum seekers, that's irrelevant. It's only for cancellation or removal cases. When they've been here for a certain amount of time, if there's an order of deportation, they can fight it in that way.
Okay, well, I'm going to give you back your presentation and I'll go back to collecting questions. And yeah.
So now we're actually going to move into differentiating just traditional treatment services with evaluations. And this is just important as we think of what it looks like, because there are these like distinctions. Obviously, we're using the clinical skills that we've already developed and honed in on, but it is a different service, and it is unique and for a vulnerable population. So Miriam and I wanted that time to make it more real for you guys and just speak of even what our experience has been, going from trained treatment providers to more of this evaluation piece for these cases. So I like to remind that obviously we have the clinical skills, but when I graduated, I didn't even know this was a service that was needed. Obviously, I knew about immigrant rights and the social injustices just based on that, but I had no idea that there was a service that mental health providers could provide that could actually help them in a very direct way. So I think I'm going to kick it to Miriam so that I want her to share really what she's like enjoyed about this type of work as an evaluator. Yeah, Miriam, can you share just what stands out as like that biggest difference and what how it's felt for you?
Absolutely. So context-wise, I've been providing trauma-focused therapy for about 9 years in different contexts in terms of like community health settings and things like that. And the big difference for me in terms of like what really drew me to this process is I especially being in trauma heavy work, I really had never had this experience of like kind of short-term brief intervention or like short-term kind of therapeutic relationships. And I found it to be much more impactful than I would have expected of having this like singular, usually one interview with a client. You know, I feel like I've really enjoyed the process of being able to like provide this additional support in cases where a lot of folks feel pretty exhausted by the time they get to us with their immigration processes, pretty hopeless. And this really is an empowering process for them to bring their story to the forefront and then being able to support them through that and provide this piece of evidence that's going to be helpful towards the case. I feel like for myself personally as a provider, when I'm working with like an ongoing therapy case, I do feel like I carry my clients with me. the client case code, right? Like an ongoing work of knowing we're coming back next week. We have these goals we're continuing to work on. We have these skills we're continuing to build. And I do feel like that kind of has this like slow burn in terms of using my emotional resources. In the evaluation interviews, it's intense for sure. There's definitely a different type of drain, but I do appreciate this process of being able to open up the story, provide the support, and then get this sense of closure in writing the report. I also think that's kind of like we go through our own therapeutic narrative process in writing out their story in a way that's empowering, and highlighting what their challenges have been, in support of their immigration case. So that's what comes to mind for me, is having this kind of like full sense, a bit of a sense of closure, and being able to provide support in something that otherwise can often feel kind of hopeless. Being able to establish that, hope for the future and possibilities. And how about for you? What has been like, what was your motivation to switch focus? What was it that you loved about the evaluations that caused you to make the switch?
Yeah, so in my case, it certainly fell into my lap. It happened to be a therapy case I had, and I later found out that there was an order of deportation, and so his attorney reached out. First, I wrote a letter, but then they said, "Hey, he has this court hearing, and his 4 children need to be evaluated to support his case." And this was a recent widow. The kids had just lost their mom. And so, I was new to it. So I was like, okay, I can do this. And so really that was my intro to it. Now years later, I think I've always had this, that's why I'm a social worker, just this love for like the human experience, like understanding that good and bad. And so I think it's been really neat that the evaluator role feels more like biographer, like you tell me your entire life history, from birth to present. And then I'm kind of picking up on all these things that, even if it's trauma heavy, I'm not losing sight of their story of strength, resilience, like their sacrifices, their motivation, like how they're continuing even to fight for their case. And so it's powerful, I think, to sit there and to have the full story at once. I do miss, from a treatment perspective, just the ongoing or like witnessing growth slowly and client driven. This feels different in the moment, where you're providing the space, making sure they feel comfortable to, during one session. Sometimes it could be more, but usually it's just like one session where you're asking them to be as detailed and vulnerable as possible, to be able to share the entirety of their life story as they see it. So it's been interesting. And unlike treatment cases where, we're focusing on the reason for referral, the presenting concerns, and developing a treatment plan, here we're also kind of saying, okay, what are you currently suffering? But then it's like, what are we worried? Like, what's the anticipated suffering? And so that's a different context. But yeah, between the psychoeducation and reframing for them, it ends up being a pretty powerful and still therapeutic experience, even as an evaluator. Now, within this context, we're also saying that an evaluator and treatment provider role would be a conflict of interest. And so for the cases that we serve as evaluators, it is only as evaluators. If treatment is needed, or if they're ready to continue with ongoing treatment, then that is to another provider. So let's share, what the immigration evaluation like appointment, the session looks like.
So like we mentioned, the evaluations typically are one session, and they usually take place between 2 and 3 hours. Of course, there are times where folks need more time. We might split it up into multiple sessions, but it's rarely ongoing treatment. So it's really collecting the information needed and doing the particular assessments. Within the context of these reports, we need to establish rapport and trust immediately, almost simultaneously, which one thing that for me, the difference has been is providing a little bit more, like being overly explicit in the very beginning. I probably spend the first like 10 minutes myself just providing information of this is the steps we're going to go through today. These are all the different sections. These are the things I'm going to ask questions about. I'm going to go through your life history, explaining why we're asking the questions we're asking, and then providing a little bit more self-disclosure of just explaining who I am, why I'm here, why I'm doing this type of work. Those tend to be helpful steps in terms of building that initial rapport. This is like a biopsychosocial cultural spiritual assessment, right? So it's this well-rounded perspective of all these different aspects of a person's life. And then there's a life history. We're talking about the past, present, and anticipated future. Generally, when I sit down with folks, I start with life history. We go chronologically. And then by the time we get to the end of their life story, that's usually when I tack on, if we haven't covered any questions that are specific to the case, or specific questions from the law office, that's when I'll usually touch on that. And then we'll go through, and we're going to talk more about the mental health screenings. So we go through the mental health screenings, and we'll talk about all the different steps that go into that. But this is really a time where we're holding space, and providing them an opportunity to share their stories and perspectives. Very different from that 1 hour that you'll usually spend in therapy of getting a brief kind of rundown of what their life experience is. We're really digging into the trauma history with these stories here.
Yeah, and so in trying to maximize that time, I would say our average, Miriam, probably more like 3 hours. We tell them to allot 2 to 3 hours, but really we're using the full 3 hours. If we need to go back, we certainly do. But during that time, we're really trying to maximize the time. And so we're using a mix of storytelling.
Hey, please mute your phone.
Okay, I was trying to mute for them. But we're using a mix of storytelling, conversations, guided questions. We know what information and details we absolutely need, but then as we try and increase their comfort, that's why we're using like the open-ended questions, conversations, framing questions in different ways, trying to get to the heart of the matter, providing psychoeducation to then give them more almost like feedback that then allows them to explain things in more detail. And then using the mental health screenings, that's obviously a part of the clinical interview, but even in that, being able to come back around to not just what is their rating of said symptom, but how would they even describe it? Like that allows us to really feel like we have diagnostic clarity by the end of the session. And then in preparation for this long report, we do try to gather, their quotes, the words they're using, their explanations of things. And then I always say it's really looking at, I don't consider myself a pessimist by any means, but we're really considering what is the worst case scenario here. So it's what is that cumulative like risk factors. We're not just talking about, for a lot of them, it's complex trauma, right? So we're talking about ACEs and everything, repeated trauma. What does prolonged toxic stress look like, even for the healthiest of the families that we might see? And yeah, we need to understand from their perspective and have enough insight and really feel like we're getting to know them, so that that report ends up being a personalized piece of evidence.
And so we're going to talk a little bit more about like mental health screenings. This is a crucial part of the evaluation. You will need to use mental health screenings. Generally speaking, it's the use of public domain screenings. Ones that we most commonly use are the PHQ-9, the GAD-7, the PCL-5. We've also used things like the life events checklist, the adverse childhood experiences, or culturogram. Some of these screenings not only help with diagnostic clarity, but also help in identifying traumatic events. Sometimes clients might have difficulty providing a narrative of their life and their experiences. So these can kind of help pull out what those experiences may have been. It's really individualizing culturally diverse families, considering culture gaps cultural gaps to understanding the screenings and to their reporting. A common example of this is folks that have the coping mechanism of expressing gratitude as opposed to expressing negative emotion. So I've had clients that in going through the screening, they have trouble endorsing any of the symptoms because they just want to go back to, I'm grateful to be here. I'm glad it's over. I know things will get better. I try not to think about it. And then I'll go back to, okay, but do you have moments of experiencing that negative emotion? So noting when there's gaps there. A lot of times I before even starting the screening, we will make sure to express and normalize the fact that they might need some of these things explained to them. Just because I describe a symptom doesn't necessarily mean they'll completely capture it. So even just normalizing the fact that they might need a little added understanding in going through the screenings. This really helps us understand better the family as a structure, and then individual experiences. This helps with our obviously assessment and intervention planning. We want to make sure to consider the different immigration and acculturation experiences, and of course consideration for PTSD symptoms, re-traumatization, and post-traumatic growth. Another common challenge will be when we're noticing folks that their main coping mechanism is avoidance. It can be really hard to get them to express and identify emotion. There's been times that I'll have folks, they might have scored very low on some of the screenings, but in our narrative and our discussion, they were able to identify different emotional challenges. And so I might have a section in the report where I describe their experience with avoidance or the cultural limitations to their ability to express negative emotion. So this, it provides us added context. And this obviously is one of the several components to being able to diagnose and assess what the vulnerabilities are. Always, like I said, these are the screenings we generally use. We always recommend the use of measures that you are most comfortable using based on expertise and experience in the field. There's no particular screenings that must be used in these psychological evaluations. It's really kind of figuring out for each provider what the standard is. The important thing is, more than anything, just identifying what are the presenting symptoms psychologically, that an individual might be dealing with, particularly with something like a U visa case for crime victimization. Often our goal is, we might be talking about the symptoms today and maybe they're more mild, but we might also go back to talk about right after the incident or in the months or weeks after the incident, what did these symptoms look like? So we might not just talk about what it is today, we might talk about how the symptoms presented previously.
Another thing I wanted to add is that mental health screenings are also an opportunity to ask them in the past, like if there were any episodes of depression or suicidality, or so it ends up being, obviously these screenings, a lot of them are in the last 2 weeks, but then wrapping back around and asking, have you ever felt this way? Have you ever experienced this? And then it gives us more context to be able to assess how they would respond to a change or additional trauma, or how they react under stress, because really that's what the report is about if something else happens. And so it's been powerful, and for a lot of them it's giving them the words that they never had, to be able to say, oh wow, yeah, like that is exactly how I feel.
So our third learning goal here was to examine cultural competence, which is really at the heart of effective mental health support for immigrant populations. So Dalissy is going to kind of lay out those cultural humility principles, and then we'll be getting into more practical applications about the evaluations themselves. But again, like by fostering cultural humility, we're able to create a more inclusive and understanding environment for the clients. It'll come out in not just our interviews with the clients in terms of practicing cultural humility, but also in our report writing as well.
So I'm going to try to move a little quickly, and these are just things to be thinking about in your practice, so that hopefully we still have a little more time to answer questions. But cultural humility in itself is defined as a lifelong process of self-reflection, self-critique, continual assessment of power imbalances, and the development of mutually respectful relationships and partnerships. Another way to think about it is simply maintaining an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented, like open to the other, in relation to aspects of cultural identity for that person. And so for me, when I think of the evaluations by default, I feel like it's a trauma responsive, it's an act to be trauma responsive. But I really do feel that cultural humility then serves as like that guide to allow us to offer the trauma responsive care, but also making sure that there's those opportunities to empower them and help them in their journey of healing. We're not presenting, I always tell them, I am honored to capture your story. Only you, right, can share that. And so even though I'm in the role of the evaluator, it doesn't mean that I have all the answers. I really need to hear in your own words what this experience has been like. So as we provide that, I want you to consider, you know, these different principles and what they look like in whatever role you're in.
So the four main principles of cultural humility that we're going to be covering, lifelong learning through critical self-reflection and self-critique, patient-focused interviewing and care strategies, community-based research and advocacy, and institutional accountability and consistency. So in talking a little bit about what does it mean in considering self-reflection and lifelong learner model, we're being flexible and humble enough to assess the cultural dimensions of the experiences of each person, admitting and stating we do not know, identifying and examining our patterns of unintentional and intentional racism, classism, homophobia, or any other bias. We consider our own multidimensional cultural identities and backgrounds, recognizing the position of power we hold over those we serve, particularly in the setting of immigration evaluations. In regard to patient-focused interviewing and care, this setup is less controlling, less authoritative style, language-focused interviewing process, controlling for bias against patient-initiated questions and agendas, so really making space and room for the clients throughout the process. A shift to valuing the client's agenda and perspective. Use of cross-cultural interaction techniques, enabling patients telling of his or her own illness and wellness story. Relevant and effective prevention, health promotion, and therapeutic strategies can then be developed. And we're honoring the client's life priorities, health beliefs, and life stressors as a full partner in the therapeutic alliance. This comes up a lot when we're talking about the challenges they've experienced. We want to hear it through their own lens. We don't want to be too corrective in that sense, while we're also providing, of course, psychoeducation throughout the process. But again, we want to be focused on the client's perspective and agenda as well.
The next two principles, I think I'm speaking directly, not just as evaluators, but as community providers, because I believe we have an opportunity to serve in this way. And so when we're thinking about community-based care and advocacy, it's really thinking about how clinicians should be trained, and training happening in arenas where providers are eventually going to practice, and population-based approach focused on health promotion and disease prevention. And even just to give you that example, in Delaware, we know that serving immigrants that are down south looks very different than the needs of those that are in the northern areas. They face different challenges. Downstate, we have more of the newer arrivals and less resources in the communities where they're less established. And so really considering that, working towards optimal health in communities, and that means really considering their physical, mental, and social well-being, advocacy for changes within our organizations, local and state policies and practices that we know may be impacting this community, and trying to actively respond to what we know are social determinants of health and what the effectiveness of our service delivery should be. It also means identifying, believing in and building on the assets and adaptive strengths of the communities we serve and really hearing from them. And I wanted to provide for those wherever you are, right? So many individuals speak of the request for medical records or a letter. So even if you are not an evaluator, if this like medical letter is requested or treatment letter, I recommend that it be more than just a confirmation of services and diagnosis. And it doesn't, I recommend just one page. It doesn't have to be long, but prioritizing, you know, one, using your organization letterhead and even providing like your professional bio, what your credentials are, not just the initials by your name, so that it gives added context. And then it's really going through what's the length of treatment, you're confirming the diagnosis, any medication, how long you've known the client, frequency of appointments or follow-up care needed. If there are specialties that are needed, you can list those specialties. I like to add blurbs that would include if left unmedicated or untreated or without parent or caregiver, what would the implications be to sustain their health and follow the treatment plan? And then also if there's any risk factors about worsening symptoms or anything like that, add it in. Those details make that letter, even if it's one page, hold so much more weight. Lastly, another way that I think is simple is providing information and referral opportunities, whether it's someone at the organization that's answering the phone, if a call comes in, like just knowing where you can refer, or as simple as providing fact sheets or referral sheets in the waiting room. I also think that for health providers, you've heard all of the things we've talked about. There's an opportunity you have for screening when you're communicating with families or individuals. And if you realize that there's a history of severe disabilities or inadequate home, medical, academic, history of victimization, even if it's indirect. We've had cases where an undocumented mom is dealing with the trauma of her child being sexually abused. Well, that could be a pathway to citizenship. If there's a police report, and it might go through as a U visa case. Just an example. We're seeing increased advocacy for sex and labor trafficking. So as you're hearing stories, I'm specifying labor trafficking because that's one that kind of falls under the radar. But when clients come in and they are speaking of terrible work conditions, it may be worthwhile that they speak to an immigration attorney, because there may be a case there depending on the conditions and the extent of it all. Now, if there's medical and behavioral needs or requiring long-term residential care, any of that, we're screening for things that may open the doorway for added resources, support, or an opportunity for a pathway to citizenship. And you don't have to make that determination. It's more of just a legal consult and referring them. Another way when I was working at hospitals and clinics is I always made sure to be connected to advocacy groups or nonprofits that I knew were serving them directly. And so it gave me an opportunity to kind of do that screening. And then I knew what I was referring them to, and also have it be a warm handoff. I can't sit here and say, we do know that there's a lot of fraud in the world of legal representation. And so obviously that warm handoff and making connections in the community helps. So as we become more aware, we get to challenge our local organizations or the places where we're at. And so I think asking these questions result in institutional accountability and consistency from a place of cultural humility. So that's what is the demographic profile of the staff and providers at your place of work? Is the composition of providers inclusive of members from diverse cultural, racial, ethnic, and sexual orientation backgrounds? Are providers required to undergo multicultural training as are interns, volunteers, students? Does the institution ethos support inclusion and respectful, substantive discussions of the clinical implications of differences? Just to give you a quick example, we had a T visa case, a trafficking case, and the individual, let's say he was from Ecuador, but he was being trafficked by Asians. The provider happened to be Asian. Well, guess what happened? We made sure that that power imbalance and any discomfort was overtly discussed to establish that comfort. And if that comfort wasn't established, then the case needed to be reassigned. But yeah, that's just one example. Another question to ask is, what institutional processes contradict or obstruct the lessons taught in what we know to be our multicultural curriculum and what we strive to do? What is the history of services with the surrounding community? What's the perception of said place for immigrants in the community or whatever it is? And also, what relationship between the institution and the community is being modeled? So I want you to consider that. But we are on to our final objective and we have like 15 minutes. So Miriam, you and I can like quickly, I know a lot of this is repetitive, but we want to drive it home. So.
So yeah, this is the part where we're breaking down the process of getting history while using the elements of practice. So this final segment is really gonna just nail down the theoretical knowledge into the actual practical clinical skills. So to start, some of the most important starting point is how you're managing referrals. These are the most important main referral questions. This is part of what our referral process, the questions look like. So we're starting with understanding what the type of the case is. What is the focus of the evaluation, and or who is it that needs to be evaluated? So as we discussed with the different types of cases, it might be the children, it might be the partner, it might be the individual with the undocumented status. That would all depend on the type of case. We want to request any relevant documentation that can include medical records, police reports, affidavits, IEPs, whatever we're able to get access to. Sometimes that's provided by the client. Sometimes clients are having their attorneys provide that information for us. We need to know if there is a court hearing, when it's going to be taking place, what type of hearing is it? Is it the final or the individual hearing? And again, this is for cancellation and asylum cases. That'll bring us to managing the time frame for report submission. So not only are we asking when is court, we're asking when do you need the report by, to give you ample time to review it and submit it by any filing deadlines. That can also be applicable to other types of cases that might not have court. There are filing deadlines for there could be filing deadlines for asylum, for U visa. So again, that's always a question to ask, is when that needs to be submitted by, and then knowing who is the point of contact at the law office. If you're working with a real small office, it's usually one person. But with the larger offices, there might be legal assistants that are far more available, and who also need to be included in, questions as they come up. So again, the relationships with the attorneys for us has been our major key to being able to provide these services effectively.
So we want to make sure to share like how we really strive to develop this like culturally humble environment. And so I believe wholeheartedly that it starts prior to the evaluation. So the first phone calls to our office really is how we begin to build that trust and that rapport. And so that's pausing, reflecting, reframing. When they're calling to express, this is what we need. A lot of times they may even be confused what type of case. We reassure them. We tell them, like, we will make sure so that we're providing the service you need, but we're also prepping them in what to expect. And it's not just like, I guess the difference is, instead of just saying, oh, these are our services and this is what's going to happen, it's more of we're already setting that intention. We're communicating that we're there to help and strengthen the case. We're thanking them for, making the bold move to call. We're validating, like, we know this is really difficult, but this is what these steps are going to look like. And so we're showing up in a very like authentic and warm manner from the very beginning. And even when we're quoting them, we're explaining what it is that what they're paying for covers. And to the extent that we are offering our support, that informed consent is an opportunity for rapport building. We're letting them know how we're sticking with them. We're letting them know, yes, it's one session, but if more is needed, we will certainly come back to you. And then obviously explaining, we know it's trauma heavy. And so we're letting them know that they are assigned to someone who's qualified, is going to support them all the way through. And as nervous as they may be, we will make sure that they have the support they need during to be able to communicate what's most important for their case. And then we're also reassuring them that it's a team effort. And so we'll make sure to communicate with your legal team to find out exactly when you need it, what you need, and that type of thing. So I think they feel cared for, and that is the way to establish. So during the, I skipped. During the evaluation, one of the ways that I try to establish that immediate rapport is I make space to share my role, my why, like a little bit of self-disclosure, to then say, now it's all about you. I want to hear all about you. And so I also check in with them. So how are you feeling towards the beginning, right? And that immediately lets me know. They might report, I didn't sleep last night, I was so nervous, so you're immediately establishing some of that safety and that vulnerability. Client-driven interview structure, like sometimes I follow their flow. Sometimes what they need is for me to tell them exactly in what order we're going to speak of things. And I use different concepts or psychoeducation around narrative therapy, like by you expressing that. So it's almost like I'm using those probing questions and motivation and psychoeducation to keep them talking more. Remember, they're sharing things for the first time. So it's like pausing and silence and breaks all throughout. Symptom monitoring, like stopping and asking midway through, how are you feeling now? And they're learning, or as they share their story, stopping and saying, can you tell me what you were thinking or feeling? A lot of them, great storytellers, and they're giving you all the details, but there's no emotional expression. And so being able to ask questions in different ways that allows them to be able to express. I'll say, instead of just trauma history, right? Or has there been any trauma? It might be, what is the absolute hardest phase or thing you've ever lived through in your life? And that tends to ensue something. That's just one example. We talked about using screenings as an opportunity to really cover a broader context, more than just how they've been feeling in the last 2 weeks. And then also reflecting patterns of behaviors or different things you might pick up on, like saying, it sounds like you've always felt rejected in your family. And then they're able to provide more context.
So then a real crucial step here is the ending process of the evaluation. You always want to make sure to thank the client for their courage and trust. I think that's something that they don't generally tend to expect from a provider. But it is something that, again, in terms of showing up authentically by the end, I always genuinely feel that gratitude for their trust and honesty, especially considering the weight of what they're sharing. We do provide initial clinical impressions and treatment recommendations. So this will look like often when we go through a mental health screening, I will provide them the result and what that means. I do usually explain as well that I might be able to say, well, you clearly meet the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and you're experiencing symptoms of depression. Also, through the report writing process, sometimes the specific diagnosis may change compared to my clinical impression. So it's something that I like to express, that here's what I'm seeing initially off the bat, and we'll let you know like what changes through the writing process. Treatment recommendations. I also like to normalize the fact that I'm recommending therapy. It's a very common recommendation in these types of evaluations. I set expectations for how the interview will be used in the report. So again, reminding them that much of what they said will appear in the report. We're going to use it to support their case. Also establishing the possibility of any follow-up contact. I always like to ask permission. If I come across any questions during the report writing process, do I have your permission to shoot you a text or give you a call to ask clarifying questions? It's not all that common, but it is a possibility that I like to prepare them for. We elicit feedback and reflection about their experience. What was this like for you? How are you feeling now? Providing psychoeducation about self-care after the interview. The one that seems to really hit home for clients is when I explain that they ought to be treating themselves like they're recovering from the flu or some kind of medical procedure. They tend to understand what that means, describing you might need extra rest, you might need time alone, you might notice more irritability or flashbacks. So normalizing what the possibilities are. I also like to provide some suggestions on grounding techniques, eliciting from them, what are some of your coping strategies? What do you think will be helpful this evening after this interview? And then giving them an opportunity to reflect on hopes for the future. This has been a really crucial component, again, because we've just talked about so much vulnerability. We've talked about worst case scenarios. We've talked about all the things they've survived, and then reflecting on, so if you're able to remain here with status, what do you hope to see for yourself and your family? And again, like recognizing that this is the point where they can often start to surrender a bit to the process, that they've completed this crucial step of doing the interview. Now the rest of the work is up to us to write the report. And they're able to kind of rest and wait, knowing that they completed often what is a final step to their evaluation process. And then how do we write a supportive report? Again, from this anti-oppressive perspective. I did see that, there's a lot of different strategies and techniques different clinicians may use in terms of structuring their report. Things that are most important is that we're reflecting on the resilience alongside these risk factors and worst case scenarios. I always like to describe to clients as well that usually our focus is strength-based. But for these evaluations, specifically for the immigration cases, we must focus on vulnerability. So how in the report do you also highlight the ways that they've bounced back and shown resilience? We normalize their experience throughout the report. An example of that is saying, as is common among victims of domestic violence, Julia found herself trapped in the abusive relationship for years, as opposed to saying she stayed in the abusive relationship for years, right? We're writing assuming the audience might not know the context of these cycles of violence. We provide definitions throughout the report and psychoeducation. So again, if I'm writing to an immigration judge or somebody working at USCIS, I'm assuming they don't understand the implications of adverse childhood experiences or re-traumatization. So we're describing, even sometimes we'll give cultural definitions. One we use often is describing the concept of machismo in a culture. Saying that it's a set of beliefs that can value men above women, that can perpetuate the cycle of violence. We consider acculturation and provide cultural contexts. We often reframe the client's avoidance, self-blame, or minimizing. This is something that comes up a lot. Clients blaming themselves for the abuse they suffered, being able to, within the report, highlight where their vulnerabilities are and what may have led them to those situations. We try to avoid over generalization or stereotyping, sticking to the specific case and what their experience was. We highlight any discrimination that they've experienced. We use what I like to describe as assertive language. So as opposed to saying they experienced unwanted sexual contact, I would say they experienced a sexual assault, right? So being able to really describe what it is with assertive language versus maybe perhaps the more passive language that a client might use. And then having clear sections and organization throughout the report is a big one. I saw some of the chat questions pop up asking about templates for reports. One of our real strengths, I think, in the way that we structure our reports is having everything really laid out. So the narrative section, here's the case summary, here's the narrative of their life, Here's the mental health screening results. Here's the medical section. Even throughout the clinical impressions, when we have to highlight risk factors, we're going through each and every one, and they're very clearly defined and then also able to find. We want to assume that the immigration judge doesn't want to read the whole report, so they can very easily identify the information that they're looking for. So now we have some insights and reflections that we wanted to provide as we're wrapping up here.
Yeah, I think because we only have a few minutes, we can share a little more or really open it up. Any questions, comments, whatever it is. Yeah.
I think one of the main questions I was getting in the chat was the use of the word psychological evaluations and how as social workers, we tend to utilize the word biopsychosocial. For me, I gathered what you were saying. It was kind of just like doing this thorough evaluation of that person and providing all of that information in one place. But can you just clarify that for?
I'll define it. I try to stick to just the umbrella psychological evaluation based on what we know that USCIS and Immigration Court is asking for. Obviously, clinically, we may know, right, what different psychological testing, or even if, let's say, cognitive testing is needed, like there are different types of psychological evaluations, and even the way we're trained. So that would be to the discretion, right, of the provider. But psychological evaluations, these immigration evaluations, that is what would be asked for from these offices by a licensed mental health provider. And so that is why we're using that term. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and I did some looking while you were in the thing, and I do see that there are a few different ways that are used. I think in New York City, they use the immigration psychological evaluation or a hardship evaluation, and there's a few others. So I think what our facilitator is saying is do your research in your state and what your state deems it as possible for you to call it, then go by that. I know that someone mentioned about psychologists. I don't think that this is alluding to social workers being psychologists. It's two different mental health professions. They want to know, do you have a prototype on how the evaluations that you provide?
Similar to what Miriam just provided, but based on even the questions now, I like to establish, formatting wise, we do include the professional bio right in the report. We include what the role of the evaluator is, including, licensure and all of that is, of course, going to come, your expertise or whatever in that professional bio. Also, the introduction of what was this evaluation for and what it was assessing. So depending on the type of case it is, you have an opportunity to immediately establish that in the report, and then using those headings and subheadings. The case summary is an opportunity to do a quick summary, like when you think of a research paper, I'm losing the word right now.
Abstract.
The abstract, yeah. So it's like, if I tell you really quick, this is a person seeking whatever status for these reasons, they present with these vulnerabilities, psychological, medical, this, like a quick snapshot of the case. I think that helps in general, but then you increasingly become more and more detailed. If we're saying that there's been, for example, for VAWA with IPV instances, then we are qualifying all of the types of abuse. We're defining all of them, and then we're providing the examples of what that person endured that qualifies under said type of abuse. And then always recommendations, right, at the end. So your clinical impressions where you're developing all of the information, and then recommendations is another opportunity, whether it's family reunification, and recommendations that any of us would have even for added treatment, continuity of care for their high blood pressure, seeking further testing if necessary, that type of thing.
Right. And we do have a few questions that I'm going to send to the presenters after this presentation is done and see if they can provide some answers. And then I will send that in the wrap up. So if you want to keep in touch, I encourage you to take a picture of this page and keep in touch with both of these amazing facilitators, but I just wanted to say really quickly when it comes to the CEU requirements. So this program was monitored for time duration. So if you stayed in the program the entire time, you will receive your 2 hours CEU. If you happen to have joined the program after an hour after we started, for whatever reason, I will grant you 1 hour of CEU time because I have to follow by the board's regulation. I will be sending out a survey, and then once you complete that survey within 2 weeks, you will get your CEUs emailed to you. If you do not get your CEUs in 2 weeks, please reach out to me. And if at that time I am provided with any resources from the presenters, I will provide that to you, whether it's the answers to questions or a copy of the slides or additional resources. Whatever I'm given will come to you in the form of an email. Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with NASW Delaware. It was a pleasure sitting in on this presentation. And from what I'm seeing in the chat, everyone thought that this was great information and really needed. So thank you, Dalissy and Miriam, for providing this as a safe space and also a place of education for our social workers. So that's the end of our program. We are happy that you guys are here, and do your surveys, because if you do your surveys and this is a presentation that you enjoyed, we will try our hardest to have the facilitators back for a part 2. So do your surveys.
Thank you so much, everyone.